matter who's here, as kol hakavod, but just I'm sorry you didn't come with a costume. I'm really disappointed. And I wanted to say, if those of you are wondering, this is a shaitel. Because people have been asking me, so I'm saying. And okay.
Okay, well, it's nice to see a full room. It's been a difficult semester in terms of that. Now, for those of you who are not regulars, our topic for this semester is we have been studying Tshuva in Tanakh. We've been studying stories that many of us are familiar with, but we're coming at it from the angle of the Tshuva. So therefore, when it came to the Yom Iyun, it obviously made sense that we would continue with the same topic that we're studying, and that is the Tshuva in Megillat Esther. Now, when we studied the book of Shoftim, we spoke about the fact that in Shoftim, there is a cycle that we called the S cycle. The reason we call it the S cycle is because it begins with sin. And the sin in the book of Shoftim is usually avodah zarah. Then comes the subjugation, where God sends some sort of enemy, be it the Canaanites, be it the Philistines, whoever it is, and the Jews are subjugated to an enemy. Then comes the supplication, where the Jews turn to God in prayer, and then comes the salvation through the Navi, or the Shofet. So it's sin, subjugation, supplication, salvation. And this is seen most clearly in the book of Shoftim, but we see it in other places as well. Now, when we look at the Megillah, we have very clearly the subjugation, and we have very clearly the salvation, but we seem to be missing the sin and the supplication. Now, it's a very well-known, I think, idea that appears in source number 2. In source number 2, we have the Gemara in Megillah that is exactly asking this question. Again, if there is suffering in all the biblical books except for Eov, there has to be some sort of sin. So that's what Chazal are asking here. What is the sin of the people of this time? So the Gemara Megillah on 12a tells us, the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, for what reason will the enemies of the Jewish people, that's a euphemism for the Jewish people themselves, when exhibiting behavior that is not in their best interests, in that generation deserve annihilation? In other words, what was the sin? Rabbi Shimon says to them, say the answer to this question yourself. They said to him, it is because they partook of the feast of the wicked one, Achashverosh, and they partook there of forbidden foods. Rabbi Shimon responds, if so, those in Shushan should have been killed as punishment, but those in the rest of the world who did not participate in the feast should not have been killed. So answer number 1 is, what is the sin? The sin was the fact that they went to this party of Achashverosh. But if that's true, it's the people of Shushan. What about the people who live in the other 126 Medinot? So the student said to Rabbi Shimon, so you tell us your response to the question. He said to them, it is because they prostrated before the idol that the Nebuchadnezzar had made, as is recorded that the entire world bowed down before it, except for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So Rabbi Shimon is saying that it's because of something that happened. Now remember, the story of Esther is happening at the end of the exile, towards already the beginning of the second temple. The story of Nebuchadnezzar and his idol, which appears in the story of of Daniel, is the story that appears much earlier in the, so we're talking about something that happened 60 years earlier. But here the Gemara gives us these two opinions, either because they participated in the party where they should not have, or because of this avodah zarah that we have earlier with Nebuchadnezzar, and the only ones who don't bow down on Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they get thrown into the Kivshan Ha'esh. That's a whole different story. Now, if we look at source number 3 takes this same idea, but makes it, I think, a little bit more serious. So source number 3 is the Midrash on Megillat Esther, And it says Haman to Achashverosh, the God of these men hate lewdness. Make a feast for them and set harlots before them, and order them that they should all come, eat, drink, and do as they please, as it says, to do according to every man's pleasure. When Mordecai saw this, he rose and issued a proclamation saying, do not partake in the feast of Achashverosh, since he has invited you only, I'm at the top of page 2, only in order to be able to lodge a complaint against him, so that the attribute of justice should have an excuse for accusing you before the Holy One, blessed be he. But they did not listen to Mordecai, and they all went to the feast. Rav Yishmael said, 18,500 went to the banquet and ate and drank and became drunk and misconducted themselves. Straight away, Satan arose and accused them before the Holy One, blessed be he, saying, Sovereign of the universe, how long will you cleave to this nation who turned their heart and faith from you? If it is so, please, you destroy this nation from the world because they do not repent before you. Now, this midrash is interesting because it adds some new perspectives to our story. First of all, it puts Haman already at the beginning of the story. We're used to Haman showing up only in chapter 3 because Mordecai doesn't bow down, etc. Here, the midrash is already putting Haman before our story, and he's saying that he is the brains here, and that he's telling Ahasuerus specifically to invite the Jews in order to get the Jews to sin. This should remind you very much of Bilam, right? This is the thing we have with Bilam, that he sends the daughters out in order to entice the Jews. So this is one thing that's interesting, is that it brings Haman's the story. The second thing that's interesting is that when you see it, think of, okay, so they went to the party. Okay, so it's inappropriate that they're at the party. Now, this midrash is saying that there was a lot of inappropriate things going on at that party, which also, though, perhaps explains to us also why Vashti refuses to go to the party, because we understand what was going on there with the women at the party, and Vashti says, I don't want to have any part of that. So that's also an interesting thing that we can understand from this midrash. And I think the other thing that's interesting here is that this is a midrash that tells us that Mordecai specifically got up and told the people not to go. So it's not only that they went to the party, but they're going to the party against the advice of Mordecai. So this midrash gives us some interesting perspectives on some of our stories. But again, none of this is blatant in the Psukim. If we have to look for a sin in the Psukim, I think we might find it if we jump back to source number 1. Source number 1 is in Perek Gimel in the book of Esther, when Haman comes to Ahasuerus when he decides he wants to kill the Jews. Source number 1. And he says, Vayama Haman l'melech Ahasuerus, Yeshno am echad mifuzar umiforad bein ha'amim. Now, why do we need a nation that is both scattered and dispersed? Why do we have both these terminologies? So on one hand, you could say that, yes, physically they are scattered, but then we also get this impression that not only are they separated physically from each other, but there is a tremendous amount of disunity between the people. And Haman is picking up on that disunity. So now we have the party. We have the disunity, we have and now let's think, so this perhaps are our sins. Let's look and see, do we have the tshuva in the Mikra? So already if we go to chapter 4, we have Esther. Excuse me, it's in the same, it's source number 1, but chapter 4. We have when Mordecai comes to Esther and says you have to do something, what does Esther do? Esther says, Lech knos et kol ha-Yehudim. So this is the beginning, and I think it's clear to everybody, this is the tshuva that we have in the book of Esther. The idea where, first of all, if everybody's spread out, what is the way to fix that is to gather. Knos et kol ha-Yehudim. And Al tochlu va'al tishtu. If the sin came about because they ate and drank, then the tshuva for that is don't eat and drink, right? And fast and go fast, and me and my girls will do the same. And then, of course, we have in chapter 9, when we have the discussion of what the Jews do and what we do on Purim today, the whole idea of Mishloach Manot, Ish Lo Re'ehu, Matanot LeEvyonim, is the perfect way to, if there was a division between people, is in order to bring unity between man and his neighbors. So that could be perhaps the tshuva that we see in the Mikra. So now we can also have, we have a sin, we have subjugation, clearly, we have the supplication in the time of the Leis Kenos Kol Yudim, and then we have the salvation that is so clear. Now, if you jump into source number 5, source number 5 is the Rambam in Hilchot Ta'anit. Because remember, that is what Esther is doing. Esther is calling a 3-day Ta'anit. And in for lack of time, I'm not going to read it. You have it there in front of you. But basically, the Rambam says the purpose of Ta'anit is not just to not eat and drink, but the purpose of Ta'anit is a major part of the tshuva process. And that you're supposed to take these days of fast days and use them to return to God. And so that when you see Esther, and you see when she says fast, in your mind, you're automatically supposed to interpret fast as not a day to go shopping, but rather this is a day of returning to God. So that we do have, I think, although it's not blatant, I think it's clear to everybody who reads the Megillah that there is this attitude of trying to correct that which was wrong in that time. However, I think that if we take it a step further, although it's not necessarily in the Megillah per se, there is a very well-known concept that appears in source number 8. In source number 8, the Medrash Mishlei tells us all of the holidays will be nullified in the future, but the days of Purim will not be nullified. That in Achrita Yamim, there's a whole discussion. Will there be mitzvot? Will there not be mitzvot? What's going to happen there? And this Medrash tells us that we're not going to have the regular holidays, but Purim is always going to exist because it states in the book of Esther, and these days of Purim will not be rescinded from the Jews. And Rabbi Elazar also says Yom Kippur will forever not be nullified, as it states. It will be for you an everlasting statute to atone for the children of Israel and all of their sins once a year. And so this becomes the famous, well-known connection between Purim and Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur. Now, first of all, notice if we call it Purim and Kippurim, which is the first and which is compared to it. So, which is ironic because obviously Yom Kippur is a biblical holiday where Purim was established many generations later. How could it be? And everybody realizes that those are two different verbs, right? Kippurim is from lechaper and Purim is from hipil pur. So those are two, right? So you all understand already that those are two different biblical words, even though the sound is the same, the root is different. But obviously the idea here is that it's not only the name per se that's making the comparison, and that's what we're going to have to do is we want to look at what is the comparison, because as soon as we're comparing Purim to Yom Kippur is a day of Tshuva. So therefore, obviously, we're saying that Purim also has to be from Tshuva, and that's what we're going to analyze. So the very first comparison that we have between these two holidays is what we have here in source number 8, and that is that these two holidays will be forever. That's explanation number 1. Explanation number 2 is, I think, a very, very beautiful one, which comes from the same Tikkunei Zohar, but this time 9b, on the middle of page 3. Let's start with 9 and then 9b. It is called Purim because of Yom HaKippurim. For in the future, people will rejoice on Yom Kippur and will transform its required affliction to delight. Although the divine presence forbade the wearing of shoes on Yom Kippur, At that time, people will quote the verse, "How beautiful are your footsteps in the sandals, O Prince daughter from Shir Shirim," and pleasure, joy, and much good will happen on that day. This will be the case in the time of the coming redemption. So this is number 2. Number 2 here is saying what is the comparison here between Yom Kippur and Purim is the concept of simcha. That these are both days of joy. And if you look at source number 10, a very well-known Mishnah in Ta'anit, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, there are no days as joyous to the Jewish people as the 15th of Av and as Yom Kippur. So though if you ask the average guy in the street, Yom Purim is the day of Sason B'Simcha. Now the Mishnah is telling us that also Yom Kippur is a day of joy as well. And the joy comes, if you jump back a second to source number 6, which begins at the bottom of page 2. Source number 6 is from Rav Kook's Untitled Chapter. He tells us, one must understand the profound nature of tshuva. Tshuva should shine so powerfully that remembering a sin actually awakes a feeling of profound joy. Joy comes from the knowledge that by doing tshuva, one gives value and purpose to one's past mistakes. In other words, you could look at a sin and you could feel bad and you could feel guilt and you could get stuck in that murk. And here Rav Kook is saying that no, not only do you not take it, but you can look at that sin as an opportunity to grow, as an opportunity to come closer to God as a result of that sin, and that should cause you a tremendous amount of joy. So it gives us a whole different perspective on the concept of tshuva and the concept of sinning. But let's take it even a step further in terms of the joy. One of the most joyous parts of the Yom Kippur was when the Kohen Gadol yatsa mi Beit HaKodesh HaKodashim, right? Mara Kohen, we all remember over the past couple of years, it has become, I think, a highlight of the Yom Kippur service. And if we go into 9b tells us this is Yom Kippurim. When the high priest is clothed in beautiful clothing of atonement, the tzitz, the mitznefet, the avneit, the 4 white garments from the right side. When he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, he's only wearing white, and the 4 garments of gold from the left side that he wears during the regular avodah of that day. At the same time, Esther, beautified herself with clothing of forgiveness. That is what is meant by the verse, and Esther put on royal clothing before she enters into the antechamber of Achashverosh. And with these garments, she entered into the inner sanctum. That is what the verse means. She stood in the inner court of the king's house. And when it says that she found favor in his eyes, Purim is named for Yom Kippur. For in the future, they will delight in it and change it from affliction to delight. What is this Medrash telling us? It's actually comparing Esther to the Kohen Gadol. Just the way the Kohen Gadol puts on special clothing before he enters the Kodesh HaKodashim, and he goes to a place where only he can be entered once a year, and when he goes in there, he is risking death. So too, when Esther changes her clothing and stands before the place, before she goes into Achashverosh, she too is risking her life. And what is the Kohen Gadol doing when he goes into the Kodesh HaKodashim? He's praying for Jewish people. What is Esther doing when she's going into the inner sanctum of Achashverosh? She too is praying for their behalf. So now, by the way, there's a tremendous amount of other comparisons here between Megillat Esther on one hand and the Beit HaMikdash on the other. The only 2 cities that are ever called Habira in all of Mikra is Shushan Habira and Yerushalayim Habira. That whole chapter Aleph, Chor, Karpas, Techelet, all of those descriptions. Why do I need those descriptions of the palace? Because those descriptions of the palace are supposed to remind you of the Beit HaMikdash. It's those same words as well. The whole idea of the Kohen Gadol switching his clothing on Yom Kippur is something, first of all, that we saw that Esther does when she's Telebesh Malchut. That, of course, is something that we do also, which should give a new significance, perhaps, to the dressing up on Yom Kippur. Excuse me, on Purim. And let's go back to source number 10 for a second. When we talked about the joy of Yom Kippur, one of the reasons it's joy, because the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in white clothes, and which each woman had borrowed. They're not wearing their own clothing, which is also something interesting here as well. So we're comparing Purim to Yom Kippur. Our first idea was that it's going to be in existence forever. Our second was the concept of joy connected to both. And now our third answer is the comparison of Esther to the high priest. The next comparison goes back to also something that we referenced. We said that one of the problems of Purim was the disunity of the people. Both Yom Kippur and Purim have elements of unity. Now, Purim is obvious to us, as we said, this whole idea of Mishloach Manot and everybody doing it together. On Yom Kippur, we are like the angels, right? We don't eat, we don't drink, we wear white clothing, we stand, all of those things. We say Baruch Shem out loud. One of the things that that's significant about the angels is there is no conflict between angels. And we have this in Shacharit. No, really, but we say it in Shacharit every day, right? Kulam omrim ba'ahava. No, you say. No, you say. And they respect each other back. And then kulam omrim b'yachad kadosh kadosh. That's the whole description that we have here, is this unity of, and there's no jealousy among them as well. That's right. So we have this idea of unity both on Yom Kippur and Purim. We have the idea also, obviously, and here we have it in source number 12. Rabbi Pincus quotes the Maharal, and he explains that the reason that these 2 days, Purim and Yom Kippur, will never be nullified, right? Obviously, by the way, that's also a question. If we said the whole idea is comparing the two, that they're never going to be nullified, well, why not? So these answers are obviously connected to each other, is that both pertain to the very existence of Israel as a people. Were it not for Yom Kippur, transgressions would overcome us, heaven forbid. We'd have too many sins to be able to live. Rabbi Eliezer says, and likewise on Purim, we were rescued from the terrible decree to destroy, to kill, and wipe out all the Jews. So here we could actually make the distinction that whereas Yom Kippur is our survival spiritually, Purim is the survival physically. But that is definitely a comparison between the two of them. The next comparison is actually quite fascinating, and that comes from a major part of the Yom Kippur service, which we actually studied here in our tshuva, is the picking of the Yom Kippur of the lottery. There's lottery on Yom Kippur, and there's lottery on Purim. What is the lottery on Yom Kippur? Remember, he brings 2 seirim who look identical, and the Kohen Gadol puts his hand and he takes out one, goes LaHashem, and his blood is being sprinkled on the Mizbeach, and the other one is sent out LaAzazel. And we spent a lot of talk about what is Azazel? Is it a name? Is it a place? Is it an angel? What is the concept of these 2 lots? But it's obviously clear that the lots here are significant because it compares the two concepts together. Now, if you look at source number 13, source number 13 is Rabbi Grossman, where he talks about what is the difference, what makes the difference between the lot in the Beit HaMikdash and the lot that Haman is organizing. At top of page 4. Haman's lot, which was done on the 10th of Nisan, is cast amongst drinking of wine with faith in complete determination that takes no account to the levels of person's morality. Man has the power to use the forces at work in the world to enlist them for his own purposes. Once he is successful in discovering the fixed laws according to which the world operates, he is free to become drunk and act as he pleases. The the lottery of Haman is what Amalek stands for. We know that Amalek is Asher Karcha Baderech. What does that mean that they Karcha Baderech? They happened upon you. Amalek stands for the people in the world who believe that there is nothing in the world other than coincidence. Things happen. It's completely not related to anything you do. There is no reward and punishment. Even if there is a God, he isn't involved in what you do. So therefore, you don't have to answer to anybody. And therefore, you can become drunk and ask as you please, which is what Amalek stands for, that everything in the world is coincidental. The lot of the Kohen Gadol on the 10th of Tishrei, now that's also an interesting parallel, but that was the 10th of Nisan, this is the 10th of Tishrei, is cast in the midst of the fast. He's not drinking, the Kohen Gadol, he's in the middle of fasting with confession and repentance. His fasting is, of course, related to a stance before God, who requires that a person act morally. Casting the lot means leaving the decision to the one who created the world, with the faith that he, God, will intervene and guide events in accordance with the moral and religious endeavors of his adherents. And by the way, perhaps maybe that's why they're different words. The word in the Megillat is a pur, and the word on Yom Kippur is goral. We use the same word in English, lottery, but in essence, there are two different Hebrew words. And here we're understanding that they're coming from two completely different places. Haman's is from his own. It makes no difference. What difference does it make? Let's just pick something randomly out of a hat. And the Kohen Gadol's is no, that there is a God here who's determining which is going to be La Hashem and which is going to be La Azazel. With Haman's deterministic world ruled by fixed laws and times that cannot be changed, and this becomes the whole idea of Yom Kippur and Purim in a minute, the Holy One intervened and turned that clear, absolute world of Haman into a world full of the Nahafochu, of overturning, a world in which the sinner ends up losing. The first lot, it says, was cast lifnei Haman, before Haman. The location hints at the fundamental approach of one who casts the lot. The basic assumption underlying the casting of Haman's lot is a fixed and absolute determinism. Happens, with no room for argument. The lots of Am Yisrael express a belief in hashgacha pratis, in providence. One lot is cast before Haman, while the other is cast before God. This difference leads either to a party or to a fast. It leads to two different perspectives on life, to inebriation and immorality, or to tshuva and atonement. Haman himself sees himself as ruling the natural forces that act upon and influence the characteristics of time, therefore as a god, which also makes reference, you all learned when you were in Gan, that the reason Haman refuses to bow down to Haman is because Haman wears a little idol, right? Anybody? Nobody? Thank you. Okay, this is, look, gotta not love this. Gotta not love this idea that why doesn't Mordechai bow down to Haman? Because he wore an idol and it's idol worship. But here, this Rev Grossman is explaining us, it's not that there was an idol on Haman, but rather Haman has turned himself into a god. That's the idea. When you say there's nothing in the world, and I'm the one who makes all the decisions because there's nothing higher than me, that's man has turned himself into God. And here the idea is of comparing the lots of Purim to the lots of Yom Kippur. We're saying that it is actually just the opposite idea, and that we believe that God is the one who is controlling everything and is rewarding us according to our behaviors. Now, another idea about these two goats, what is the goat called in Hebrew? The goat is called a seir. A seir, that's the Hebrew word for goat. Who else is seir? Esav. Esav lives on Har Seir. Amalek is a descendant of Esav. We have two identical goats on Yom Kippur. And one of the ideas that we have on Purim is you shouldn't be able to know the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman. Who in Torah made a mistake between twins and wasn't able to differentiate between the good twin and the bad twin? Yitzchak. So that we have an idea here of Yitzchak and the two goats and confusing the righteous one and the evil one played out with the two Seirim. One ends up going Lazazel to Esav, one ends up going LaHashem, although they both start as twins, playing through here with the grandson of Esav comes to play here as well. Taking this a step further, Rav Soloveitchik talks about the lottery. And he says, what's the whole idea of the lottery? It's not only to show that we believe in divine providence, but he also says that the whole idea of the lottery is to show the vulnerability of human existence. And I don't know about you personally, but the older I get, the more I understand this concept of how, and you could even see this in history, right? I mean, the Jews in Ukraine, 3 weeks ago, life was as well as life could be in a third world country, but it was basically the Seder, and then overnight.
Yes, but you have to, that's the vulnerability of human beings.
Right.
But then you have to get, if I understood you right, you're connecting that with lottery. That I don't get.
So that's exactly, we haven't answered that yet. Let's, for those of you on the outside, we're talking about, so what is the difference between the lottery? How does the lottery connect to the vulnerability? So let's look at it inside in source number 4, in the Rav's own words. He says, 14, perhaps the common feature to both Purim and Yom Kippur is the aspect of Purim, which is a call for divine compassion and intercession, a mood of petition rising out of great distress. Purim, therefore, epitomizes the instability, the uncertainty, and the vulnerability which characterizes human life generally, but particularly governs the destiny of Jews, and specifically the destiny of Jews who live in exile. It alerts the Jew to the sudden turn of fortune, lurking dangers, the fickleness of life, even as the Goral itself seems to operate by blind chance. It is because of this that man can stand before the heavenly bar of justice on Yom Kippur, hoping for compassion and forgiveness. Despite his free will and accountability for his deeds, man enters his plea before the Almighty, claiming that he is not the author and the designer of worldly pleasures, but they were too powerful for him to resist. Why should God forgive me on Yom Kippur? Why should God give me another chance? Because as we say on Yom Kippur, what are we? We're no better than an alen nidaf, kitzitz over. We are nothing in the scheme of, our lives, as we said, can change just momentarily. So the message of the Goral on Purim, according to the Rav, is what allows us to be successful on Yom Kippur, that God should give us another chance because we are so vulnerable, and in any second, life can change. And so the idea perhaps of Yom Kippur and the Goral and Purim, therefore, is for us to come face to face with that vulnerability. And once we do that, based on the Gorals, it brings us to seek God's compassion. We realize how much we are dependent on God and how necessary our existence is for him. Now we're going to continue with the same idea in a second. I just want to point out one other fact of interest. You will notice the only 2 holidays that we don't say Hallel on. Another interesting idea. Now let's continue with perhaps what's probably going to be the highlight here of our share, and that is this source that appears in number 15. Now I apologize. The first half I was able to find in English. The second I wasn't. I apologize. Rev Hutner in the Pachad Yitzchak begins by quoting the Vilna Gaon, and the first thing he says is, "We have already mentioned on several occasions the holy words of the Vilna Gaon, who explains the teaching of the sages that Purim and the Day of Atonement, the day like Purim, are of the same nature. The Gaon explains that we find in the Gemara in Beitzah that all festivals are a teaching of half for God and half for you. Now, this is a concept we all know, right? Rosh Hashanah, you spend half the day in Shul, and then you come home and you're supposed to have a very beautiful meal. Chetzi Lashem, we call it, and Chetzi Lachem. This is actually supposed to be Shabbat as well. You're supposed to spend half the time learning and half the time doing whatever else you do on Shabbat. You laugh, but Rev Melamed in Har Bracha teaches his students that they have to spend 8 hours learning Torah on Shabbat. He does the math. He says that's what it means, Chetzi Lashem and Chetzi Lachem. Anyway, festivals mandate us both to perform religious duties towards God and also to enjoy ourselves in physical ways. So in this sense, Purim and Yom Kippur are two halves of one complete entity. He says it's not two different holidays, but rather it's one holiday, with the Yom Kippur being the Chetzi Lashem and the Purim being the Chetzi Lachem, right? Because what on Yom Kippur, it's all La Hashem, because there's no eating and there's no drinking and it's all day in Shul. And Purim is not only Chetzi La Hashem, it's all day La Hashem. I mean, when I was growing up in America, everybody went to work, right? There was no Isur Melacha on Purim, and there's no, because it's all for man. There's no, other than the regular Shacharit and the Megillah reading, it's basically Chetzi Lachem and Chetzi. So it's, in other words, what the Gaon is saying here is that there are two halves, that one without the other isn't complete, because you have to have both of them. And by the way, let me just point out, on Yom Kippur, we eat and then fast. On Purim, we fast and then eat. Nahum, just recognize that as well. But in other words, we are saying here what the Gaon is saying here, the Vilna Gaon is saying here, is that you have to sort of both, they are incomplete without the other, and you need to have both ideas as well. Now, here's where it starts getting interesting. Now, in order to understand the rest of the Gaon in source 15, first I need to familiarize you with a Gemara in 16. The Gemara in Shabbat tells a highly unusual story. Here's how the story goes. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yonatan said, "What is the meaning of that which is written in Yeshayahu? For you are our father, for Abraham knows us not, and Yisrael does not acknowledge us. You, Lord, are our father, our Redeemer, everlasting is your name." That's the pasuk in Yeshayahu. So the Gemara tells us, in the future, there will surely come, the Holy One, blessed be he, will say to Abraham, "Your children have sinned against me." Abraham will say to God, "Master of the universe, if so, let them be eradicated to sanctify your name." Right? God goes to Abraham, expecting Abraham to pray on behalf of the people. Abraham says, well, they sinned. Happens. So that God says, God doesn't want that. So God says, I'll try Yaakov. Since he experienced the pain of raising children, perhaps he will ask for mercy on the behalf. So God says to Yaakov, your children have sinned. Yaakov says before him, Master of the universe, if so, let them be eradicated to sanctify your name. That didn't work out. So then the Holy One, blessed be he. There is no reason in elders and no wisdom in youth. The elder is obviously Abraham. The youth is obviously Yaakov. Neither Abraham nor Yaakov knew how to respond properly. So then God says to Yitzchak, your children have sinned against me. Yitzchak says before him, Master of the universe, are they my children or are they your children? At Sinai, when you accorded precedence to, and when they said, Naaseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen before you, didn't you call them B'ni Bechori Yisrael, my son, my firstborn Yisrael? Now that they have sinned, you're telling me they're my children and not your children, right? Legitimate argument. 1 second. Argument number one. Argument number two, Yitzchak says, and furthermore, he says, let's get real. How much did they really sin? He says, let's do some math here. How long is a person's life? 70 years. Subtract the first 20 years of life because one is not punished for sins that you committed, as in the heavenly matters, between in the heavenly court. So a person can only be punished from the age of 20. So now we're down to 50 years. Subtract 25 years of nights. So now we're down to 25. Subtract 12 and a half years during one prays, eats, use the bathroom, does all kind of other things. So now how many years are we down from their 70 years? We're down to 12 and a half years. We made it. So then Yitzchak says to God, if you can endure them, i.e. all 12 years, and forgive them for committing that during those years, excellent. If not, let's divide it. That's what Yitzchak says to God. Let's divide the time. Half of the sins upon me, and half upon the sins upon you. And if you say all of them, then fine. I'll even take all of them because I sacrificed my soul before you, and you should forgive them due to my merit. So we have this like bizarre story. There's no other word for this, right? How do we even make sense of this?
Jewish, though.
It sounds Jewish. But how do we even make sense of this story? So if we go back to the Reb Hutner that you have at the top of page 5, I'm going to paraphrase for lack of time, but I'm beginning at source 3. I'll just start off so you see what we're talking about. Matzinu b'chazal. He says we find chazal. Ki b'sha'at cheshbon im ha'avot al odot chatei habanim. When we find God going to the avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and complaining about the sins of the fathers, tehei tanatosha Yitzchak Avinu, it was Yaakov Avinu who said, Palga elai upalgi alecha. Half for me and half for you. And he says, I'm going to explain to you what this means. He says, basically, Jews are genetically programmed to want to serve God. We want to do what's right. But there are two things that cause us to sin. What are those two things that cause us to sin? He uses an expression, Sa'or Shabbat Isa, which literally means the Yetzer Hara, and the nations of the world, either because they're persecuting us or because we're assimilating to us, but whatever it is, it's the nations of the world who are causing our problems. So those are the two issues that cause us problems. Now, who created the Yetzer Hara? God. Who created the animosity between Jews and Gentile? Yitzchak, when he gave the bracha to Esav, that's when our whole thing started. So that when Yitzchak is the forefather who comes before God and says to God, okay, the Jews sinned, let's be reasonable here. Who's causing the sin? Half me and half you. Half you because you caused the Yetzer Hara, half me because I caused the animosity between Yitzchak and Esav. So therefore, when we come to what? Yaakov and Esav. When we come to Purim now and Yom Kippur is which half of the coin? Is the God, the Yetzer Hara section of the coin, where we're saying to God and we're standing in shul. That's the real us is the ones that don't sin. The real us is the one who wants to be close to you. That's the us who wants to develop a relationship with God. And on Yom Kippur, we try to completely get rid of that physical Yetzer Hara that we have. What's Purim? Purim is the nation of the world. Is that cause of us? Because it's the animosity between Gentile and Jew, with the Jew ultimately winning as well. So that what Rav Hutner is explaining is this whole idea that we're saying of Yom Purim, Kiporrim, is that it's one coin, it's one unit. The Yom Kippur is the Yetzer Hara, Purim is the Umos HaOlam, and what we're saying to God, and perhaps also that's why we dress up, is what we're saying to God is the real me is the me that wants to be good. The real me is the me who does mitzvot. It's just other people and other things, and the Yetzer Hara and Goyim, those are the ones who are causing us to sin. And if you look at the bottom line here, the ilu b'Purim mitkayemet, I started 3 lines on the bottom, hatana shel palgi alai. That's what Yitzchak says. When he says to God in that Gemara, half for me, half for you, he says Purim is the half for him. Umikan hu machzit shel chetzion lachem. And that is the half for you. Because we find on Purim, because on Purim, we get rid of that final hurdle that prevents us with sono la'atzot with sonacha. that our will is to fulfill the will of God. And therefore, that's the whole idea of Megillat Esther. Kilomar, Nitgaleh HaHester, what is it that's being revealed on Purim? Haritzon HaPnimi Lasot Ritzonach. Our real desire to do what is right. Which I think that if we take this in a larger fashion, we also know that there are basically two types of tshuva. There's tshuva from fear and tshuva from love. And once you understand this differentiation here, it becomes very clear to us that Yom Kippur is the tshuva from fear. Yom Kippur is the tshuva from fear, because there's that fear of judgment. We stand, we don't eat, we don't drink, it's trepidation. Whereas Purim is supposed to become the tshuva for love. And I'd like to sort of close up with one last idea that is very much connected to this. Stay with me here for a moment. Remember, we spoke about at the very beginning that the reason the Jews got in trouble is they went to a party and they did whatever they did at the party. This should actually remind you of another biblical story where the Jews there was idol worship and there was party and there was all kind of misconduct. It should remind you a little bit of the Egel HaZahav. And perhaps that's why. Remember we said that Midrash that talks about Nebuchadnezzar and his idol? Why am I bringing Nebuchadnezzar's idol from 60 years earlier? I think that is in order for us to, in our mind, we're supposed to make some sort of connection between the two. Look at source number 17. Source number 17 also appears in Esther Rabbah, and it says, based on the pasuk that says, Ish haya b'Shushan, right? That there was a guy named Mordechai in the city of Shushan. There was a Jew in Shushan. Ish just teaches that Mordechai in his generation was equivalent to Moshe, who is the humblest man, right? That we have the pasuk, and Ish Moshe Anav Ma'od. Both are called Ish. Just as Moshe stood, so first of all, they're both called Ish. Just as Moshe stood in the breach, i.e., Moshe prayed to save the Jewish people, so too Mordechai was a seeker of good for his people. Just as Moshe taught Torah to Israel, so it says, so too Mordechai taught Torah to the Jews. So right away, we're beginning to understand that we're making a comparison to Moshe and Mordechai. Now, this should bring us to source number 18, which is a very well-known Gemara in Shabbat, and I hope you'll come out of it today with a new understanding. The Gemara cites an additional homiletic interpretation on the topic of the revelation at Sinai. The Torah says, and Moshe brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mount. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa says, the Jewish people actually stood under the mountain. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain, what we say, Kafa Alihem Har Kagigit. Here it's translated as turned over the Jews like a tub, and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent, and if not, there will be your burial. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, from here, there's a substantial caveat to the application to fulfill the Torah, right? The Jewish people can always come along and say, well, why are you punishing us if we're not keeping the Torah? Because we were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it's therefore not binding. Rava says, even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, as it's written, the Jews kimu v'kiblu. The Jews ordained and took it upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all that joined themselves onto them, and he taught. The Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion of Sinai. The kiblu masha kfar kiblu. So that we have in Purim here is now being not only compared to Yom Kippur, but it's also being compared to Matan Torah. Now, stay with me here for a minute. Bnei Yisrael sin, they do Chet HaEgel. What showed the Jews that God has forgiven them? When Moshe brings down the second Luchot. What day in the calendar does Moshe bring down the second Luchot? He brings it down on Yom Kippur. So we're having a Matan Torah on Yom Kippur, And we also have now a Matan Torah on Purim. So not only is it the tshuva, but we also have that beginning step as well. Now, how are we supposed to understand this Gemara of if the Jews said Na'aseh v'nishma, what does it mean that God is forcing the Jews to accept the Torah? So if we look at source number 20, well, let's look at 19 first. 19 is the Medrash in Tanhuma, which says something similar, but adds something interesting. The Israelites did not accept the Torah until the Holy One, blessed be He, arched the mountain over them like a vessel. As it says, they stood beneath the mountain. Reb Dimi, the son of Hama, stated that the Holy One, blessed be He, told Israel, if you accept the Torah, well and good, but if not, your grave will be here. And if you say that He arched the mountain over them because of the written law, isn't it true that as soon as He said to them, will you accept the Torah, they all responded, we will do and hear. Because the written law was brief and required no striving and suffering. But rather, He threatened them because of the oral law. After all, it contains the detailed explanation of the commandments, both simple and difficult. It is severe as death and as jealous as shu'al. One does not study the oral law unless he loves the Holy One, blessed be He, with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might. As it says, you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, and your might. What is this Midrash and here? Yes, they're both holidays. God gave the Torah, but He's essentially saying that there's a distinction in that when God has to force them to accept the Torah, what was He forcing them into? Accepting the oral law. When did the Jews come to accept oral law? B'simcha? On Purim. We all started with that very first medrash. Listen, we started with that very first midrash. That what was the problem of the sin? The sin was that they went to the party against Mordechai's command. Esther comes along, and we all know that when did she fast? When was the fast of the Megillah? We all know that it was on Pesach. How can Esther change a biblical command in order for Purim to happen? Purim essentially is a holiday based completely on oral law. It's a completely d'Rabbanan. It was introduced by the Rabban, all the halachot of d'Rabbanan, and it becomes the example of a halacha d'Rabbanan. And so that's what it means here. When it says that the Jews are kimu v'kiblu, it's not that they didn't accept Torah beforehand, but now they're accepting willingly the Torah Shebaal Peh. And what the Maharal explains is, he says, what does it mean when God forced the Torah over their head, the mountain over the people? It means essentially the people didn't have a choice. Why didn't they have a choice? Because everything was so clear. God spoke to the people. Well, you mean there was no free will there, really? Because God is actually forcing the people to accept Torah. What happens, though, in the Purim story? Well, we all know. What's the whole concept of the Purim story? The whole concept of the Purim story is that God is not there. God is not in your face. God, it's much more, and that's when, by the way, when Moshe brings the second luchot, the difference between the first luchot and the second luchot is the first luchot was smoke, fire, noise. The second luchot, Moshe very quietly sort of descends the mountain. It is no concept there as well. So that Purim actually becomes, I don't want to say the exact opposite of Matan Torah, but there are no trumpets. There's no smoke. There's no God here. As a matter of fact, God's name is even hidden as well, but it becomes the concept of looking for God, finding God, accepting not only Torah, but accepting all of the Torah Bechtav as well. And that's what this is what the Medrash says. One does not study the oral law unless he loves God, that you're willing to accept more. That's not like God gave. And you know that some of the other religions of the world are saying, oh, we'll accept the written Torah, but they will not accept Torah Shebichtav. And if you look down and find here, let's close with source number 21, is that very same Gemara in Tamid that I mentioned earlier. Why was there no happy day like 15th of Av and Yom Kippur? The Gemara says, granted, Yom Kippur is a day of joy because it has the elements of pardon and forgiveness. Moreover, it is the day where the last pair of tablets were given. And perhaps this becomes the most important combination between Purim and it's Purim and a new Matan Torah, a new covenant with God, and we do it sometimes through Ahava, we do it sometimes through Yira, we do it sometimes through physical, we do it sometimes through spiritual, that there are many different ways to come to God, and perhaps that is how we're supposed to understand the Purim here.
Why is it only 15 for
It goes back to the story of Pilegesh Begiva. When Pilegesh Begiva, remember there was a terrible story, and the Jews had practically wiped out the tribe of Binyamin. And they had said, we're not going to marry into Binyamin. So they made this holiday where the girls came out to the fields, and we don't give our daughters to Binyamin, they take our daughters, and Binyamin was able to, and that's why it became a day for joy. There are also some other reasons for it was a mistake. No. And that's, think about something. Here in Israel, Tshuva has become Jewish value. And this is why. This is why. Right, that's right. Isn't it?
very interesting?